Hello, welcome. Thank you for being here. In this video, we're going to talk about how to think through programming endurance training past just saying something like, I'm going to go out and do some cardio, how to put more thought into it, be a bit more intelligent about it, and hopefully get a bit better results out of it. So with that said, here are the sort of talking points for the day. We'll first define what aerobic endurance training really means, like what we're talking about when we say that. We'll talk about what happens inside your body, like how do you actually physiologically adapt to this type of exercise. We'll then talk about some of the more tactical stuff like goal setting, exercise selection, intensity, volume, frequency, and a couple different ways to structure individual training sessions to hopefully put all of this other stuff into a bit better practice. So I'm using aerobic endurance training as the sort of umbrella term to describe what we're talking about here. It wouldn't be wrong for our purposes here, to call this synonymous with cardio. But if we get a bit more granular and detailed with our definition, it'll make everything a bit more practical, make a bit more sense, and everything should just be more clear or clearer. I think that's a word. So aerobic versus anaerobic. Aerobic by definition, refers to requiring oxygen. And anaerobic means not requiring oxygen or without oxygen. Functionally, in practice, the only real relevance of that is with regard to intensity and duration of exercise. So activities that are aerobic are typically going to be a bit longer duration, whereas anaerobic activities are going to be a bit lower in duration and higher in intensity in contrast. And this kind of segues us into this topic of energy systems. Now, I do have a whole other article and video sort of explaining all three of them in a bit better detail, but just to sort of, give a bit of a primer for this video, there are three energy systems. All three of them are always active at any given point in time. It's not like any one of them are acting in isolation at the exclusion of the other. And what I mean by energy system is the systems in your body that are used to essentially turn food into fuel to produce energy to do work, like moving my arm as I talk through this. Two of which are the creatine phosphate system and the fast glycolytic system. Those two are the anaerobic energy systems because they do not require oxygen, and those are going to be used in activities where your intensity is much higher and the duration is much shorter. So a couple examples of activities that would be predominantly fueled by those anaerobic energy systems would be jumping as high as you can, doing a heavy squat, running 400 to 800-ish meters, depending on how fast you're running, things like that. Your aerobic energy system is a bit more complicated than those two. There's a bit more moving parts that sort of go into it, some more subcomponents. But in general, anything in which you are hitting fatigue after 4 minutes of exercise is going to be primarily aerobic in nature. So that could be running for 5 minutes as fast as you possibly can within 5 minutes, or it could be going on a 60-minute easy bike ride. Both of those are going to be primarily fueled by your aerobic energy systems. And so, like I said before, aerobic means requiring oxygen in order to turn fuel, such as carbohydrates or fats, into energy. This aerobic energy system needs oxygen to sort of stimulate that process, to sort of burn, act as like the gasoline to the fire, so to speak. So when we're talking about something like VO2 max, which is a pretty common and talked about metric across social media these days, this refers to the maximal volume of oxygen that can be used to fuel this energy system. So in other words, the more efficient your body is at getting oxygen out of the air into your bloodstream and then into your cells and then used to burn fats and carbohydrates into energy, the better your endurance is going to be. So when we talk about how your body actually does get better at doing that, how it gets better at using oxygen for energy production, there's kind of four key points to note that are going to drive the vast majority of the adaptive response. So the first one is something called an increase in stroke volume. So every time your heart beats, it pumps out a given volume of blood back into circulation that was just oxygenated from your lungs. As you get better at endurance training, the volume of blood that is pumped with each individual beat increases. The result of this is that at rest, your body needs to have less of a heart rate, less beats per minute in order to supply the same amount of oxygen into the circulatory system in general. And similarly, when you're at your maximum heart rate, you're pumping that much more oxygen with every heartbeat as a result of that increase in stroke volume. The next key thing that happens is an increase in capillary density. So as your blood is circulating through your body in your arteries, capillaries are sort of the exit ramps of the highway from your arteries into the working muscles. So if you were to compare two different highways, both of which are, let's say, backed up with traffic, one of which has one exit to get off the highway and another has 10 exits to get off the highway, you can imagine that the highway with 10 exits, and of which everyone is trying to get off at, is going to flow a lot more easily than the one with one exit. And that's essentially what is happening here. So your muscles get more of these capillaries, these smaller vascular structures that permeate your muscle and serve as the exit ramps for your arteries, for your main blood supply. And blood and oxygen and nutrients at large is more easy. It's easier for all that to enter the muscle as a result of this. Next up, you have an increase in what you might call a lipolytic enzyme production. Those are just the enzymes that are responsible for burning fat, essentially. So let's say we were to compare two different people who are going to run a 5K at their maximum effort, one of which is highly trained with regard to endurance training, and the other is untrained with regard to endurance training. The person who is untrained is going to use, let's say, 100% of carbohydrates to fuel that run, whereas the person who is highly trained is going to use about 50% fat and 50% carbohydrate to fuel that run. The reason for this is that when your carbohydrate stores run out, of which there is much less of compared to fats, carbohydrates are mostly stored in your muscle along with a smaller storage in your liver. Once those run out, that is when a sense of true physical fatigue tends to set in. If you talk to people who do, let's say, half marathons or marathons regularly, the feeling of hitting the wall is when these carbohydrate stores run out. It's also why people who are undergoing endurance events will tend to supplement with carbohydrates throughout the event. Because when you're about halfway through a marathon, they start to run pretty low. If you're running at, if you're running at a pace that's, going to give you a competitive time. So once they start to run low, people will supplement with them to replenish them. However, if your body is more well equipped to use fat for fuel, then it doesn't need to use your carbohydrate stores as much. And therefore those stores will last longer. And that sense of physical fatigue will be pushed off long. Fats are also unique because they can only be used for energy in the aerobic energy system. So any activity that is dependent on the creatine phosphate system or the fast glycolytic system is only going to be fueled by carbohydrates because those energy systems cannot use fat for fuel. Again, I have a better video that goes more in depth into the energy systems in particular. So I'll link that down below if you're interested in that. But bottom line here is that the better your endurance becomes, the more well equipped your body is to use fat for fuel. That's typically true during exercise as well as at rest. The last thing that occurs is an increase in mitochondrial density. So mitochondria they're called the powerhouse of the cell because that's where the vast majority of energy is produced within the cell, where most of the energy production from these energy systems takes place. So let's say you are just to make an analogy out of this, a business owner who owns factories that produces wood or something like that. One version of this person has one factory to produce his materials, whereas another person has 10 factories to produce his materials. You can imagine that the person with 10 factories is going to be much more productive and produce a lot more than the person with one factory. And so that's kind of what I'm getting at here. When you can call your mitochondria the energy producing factories, and if you have more of them, you're going to have a lot more opportunity to use oxygen to burn fats and carbohydrates into energy to fuel more endurance performance. So to summarize all of this up, basically what happens is that your heart is able to pump a lot more oxygen every time it beats. That oxygen, blood, and those nutrients are much more able to get inside the cells from the main blood supply. And then within the cells, the actual machinery used to turn oxygen, carbohydrates, fats into energy becomes much more efficient and robust in general. The next thing to bring up, and the most often overlooked, in my opinion, is good goal setting, because as I say here, it affects literally everything else that we're going to talk about going forward. So the first and obvious point is there a specific event that you are preparing for? How you prepare for a half marathon versus a sprint triathlon versus a high rocks versus a Spartan race is all going to look very different. And that's going to be further compounded on whether or not you want to compete in the race or you want to just complete it. Because that's going to affect, how flexible or rigid you are with your training, how much volume you're required to do, and everything of the like. Is there any particular mode of endurance training that you want to get better at? Do you want to get better at running, cycling, swimming? Obviously, whatever your primary goal is, if there's a specific mode of exercise you want to get better at, that's going to dictate what most of your endurance training is, but it's also going to dictate what the best sort of supplementary training is with regard to cross training, which we're going to talk about a bit later. Are you trying to maximize aerobic fitness or just supplement other types of training? So you can make the argument that a low dose of aerobic training is going to, and presuming it's structured in a way that actually gets you better at that training, is going to improve your recovery from things like strength training. But that type of structure is going to look much different than if you were trying to maximally build your aerobic fitness. Overall, though, the main point is the more clear and more specific you are about what it is you want out of aerobic endurance training at this point in time, the better results you're going to get because the much more targeted you can be with your training. Now, you can set one goal now and not stick with that goal for the rest of your life. That's not what this means to say. But any given block of programming that you follow should have a very clear target you're aiming for. So next up, let's talk about exercise selection, because this is obviously a consideration when you're talking about something like strength training, but it doesn't typically get its sort of due attention with regard to endurance training, at least in my opinion. So the first thing to think about is obviously your goals, as we just discussed about. If you want to be a better runner, most of your training with regard to endurance at least should be running, but not all of it should be running, at least for most people, in my opinion. So let's talk about cross training for a second. So cross training is the idea of using a different form of endurance exercise to supplement your primary endeavor of endurance. So if we're saying that your primary goal is to improve your running performance at some given distance, there's a number of other different types of endurance training you can use to supplement that training, and not all of which are going to be as good as the others. So when you're assessing your other options of endurance training, there's a couple of different thought processes you can go through. So one of which is what muscles are actually being used. If we think back to the 4 ways you adapt to endurance training that we spoke about before, 2 of those, the increase in stroke volume and the increase in capillary density, are going to happen systemically all across the body, no matter what type of endurance training you do. Swimming is going to cause an increase in stroke volume, so is running, etc. However, the increase in mitochondrial density, actually, let me back up because I misspoke there. The 2 that are systemic are going to be the increase in stroke volume and the increase in lipolytic enzyme production, the fat burning enzyme production. The 2 that are site specific, the ones that are only going to occur in the muscles being used, are the increase in mitochondrial density and increase in capillary density, because those 2 are specific to the muscles that are being trained. So for instance, if you are doing mostly cycling as your aerobic endurance training, your legs are going to see a significant increase in mitochondrial and capillary density. However, your upper extremities, your arms, are not going to. These next 3 points have much to do with how fatiguing an exercise is. So eccentric loading, if you're doing a squat, for example, when you're on the descent, the lowering part of the repetition, that is the eccentric portion, and the standing part where you're at the bottom and coming back up is the concentric portion. Eccentric muscle contractions during endurance training tend to be a bit more fatiguing and require a bit more recovery than purely concentric type of exercises. So for instance, if we're to compare running with cycling, intuitively most people recognize that running is a more fatiguing mode of exercise than cycling is. Part of the reason why is that every time you land on your foot, there's some degree of eccentric loading that occurs in order to control that landing, where with cycling, there is no landing. It's only concentric. You're only pushing with your legs. There is no accepting of weight. Exercises that use a greater range of motion also tend to be more fatiguing than those that use less. So if you were to compare cycling to high repetition bodyweight squats, for example, assuming the squats are full range of motion, the squats are going to be significantly more fatiguing and require significant more recovery than the cycling will. Part of that is because of the eccentric loading, but another part is because of the range of motion the muscles being taken through. Even if you were to compare full ass to grass squats compared to partial squats, the partial squats are much less fatiguing than the ass to grass squats, really for the same reason. So this isn't limited to endurance training in particular. And then finally, impact. And that one's kind of self-explanatory. Any exercise that's going to have impact as part of it is going to be a bit more fatiguing than ones that do not. Running and cycling make another good compare and contrast for that one. So, let's say a given exercise is checking off a lot of these boxes. Running, itself checks off a lot of them, which is why it tends to be one of the more fatiguing types of training. How much of it you do, how intensely you do it, and how often you do it, and how quickly and rapidly you progress that is going to be affected by that. So for instance, you can probably handle a lot more cycling throughout a given week and a faster progression of that than you can with running. If your goals revolve around general aerobic fitness or general cardiovascular health improvements in general, you're going to want to promote those adaptations systemically throughout the entire body. So you might elect 4 more exercises that have a full body component. So an aerodyne, a rower, things like that are going to be full body. Running, cycling is going to be primarily lower body, although running does have a good upper body component to it because your upper body serves as a counterweight in good running form. Swimming and the use of a ski erg are both going to be primarily upper body, as you probably know already. But the overall point is making sure you're getting those site-specific adaptations all across the entire body, so it's not just your legs or something else that's getting it. And then cross-training, again, if your running is the primary form of exercise you want to get better at, cycling is probably for most people, going to make a better form of cross training than the use of something like a skier. Or, however, let's say you're using endurance training to supplement your strength training, and therefore you want to induce those site-specific adaptations all across the entire body, so you have that, improved recovery everywhere. Then the skier might make a good sort of cross training for that. So next up, we have intensity of exercise, or in other words, how hard are you pushing at any given point in time in a training session? So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to make this all sound very complicated, and then I'm going to make it all sound stupidly easy. So if you just bear with me for a second, that's the sort of progression we're going to go through here. So here we have a graph of something called lactate. So whenever you do exercise, something called lactate and acid along with it is being built up in the muscles. This increase in acid in the muscle can limit your muscle's actual ability to contract, as well as their ability to produce further energy. So as a result, the more of it that is being produced and the faster it is being produced, the more difficult a given form of exercise is going to feel. And similarly, the harder you push in an exercise, so with running, the faster that you are running, the more lactate that is going to be built up. With regard to this relationship between exercise intensity, or how hard you're pushing, and the lactate that's in your blood, there's two sort of key points here. There's 2 millimoles of lactate per liter of blood and 4 millimoles of lactate per liter of blood. What happens is as you cross 2, the rate of that lactate in acid buildup tends to increase relative to what I was doing before. And then the same thing happens once you cross 4. So once you're past 4 millimoles of lactate per liter of blood, the rate at which that's going to increase is going to be faster than when you're between 2 and 4. And when you're under 2, that's going to be slower than when you're between 2 and 4. Across social media, the 5-zone model, as I list here, is the more popular one. And the zone 2 that most people are going to talk about, the one that someone like Peter Attia, who feels weird to reference in this video because he was very common among the Epstein files. That's obviously a different topic here. But the zone 2 that he sort of popularized is a zone 2 of the 5-zone model. And the graph here is the 3-zone model. So what the 5-zone model seeks to do is essentially cut this zone 1 and this zone 2 in half. So there'd be a zone 1 here, a zone 2 here, a zone 3 here, 4, and then zone 5 would be your zone 3 here. However, I do not like that means of measuring exercise intensity for 2 reasons. One, I don't think there's good enough evidence to say that, if we're going to split this zone 1 on this graph right here in half and say that the lower half is zone 1, higher half is zone 2, that whether you're in those theoretical zone 1, zone 2s, that there's going to be that much of a training difference or an adaptation difference if your total volume is equated. I just don't think that's going to be the case. And then secondly, it just needlessly complicates the way you need to think about this. So if we look at this graph, there are 3 different zones here, obviously, as are demarked: zone 1, zone 2, zone 3. Zone 1 is going to correspond very well to most people's subjective description of easy training. Zone 2 is going to correspond very well to most people's subjective description of moderate intensity training. And then zone 3 is going to correlate to most people's description of hard training. And that tends to transfer pretty well as you get better. So for instance, if you were to undergo an aerobic endurance training program and you became more fit, your zone 2 and what feels moderate to you is going to improve with correspondence to one another. Now, how much time you spend in each one of these zones is going to be very dependent upon what you are trying to do. For instance, if you are trying to prepare for a marathon, you're going to want to spend a lot longer of a time and, probably train more overall, but a lot more time in this zone 1 and this easy intensity so that you can accumulate all the volume you need to accumulate for that event. However, if you are training for a 5K and you want to just improve the amount of time you complete that in, you're going to want to spend much more time in zone 2 and zone 3 because those are the zones you're going to be in on the actual day you attempt the 5K. How this ends up being split up in terms of what percent you spend at each given intensity across a week is termed your training intensity distribution, or your TID. So when you're talking about volume, what you can measure in terms of duration, like minutes, hours, whatever, or in terms of distance, like miles, kilometers for people not from the US. But however you're measuring volume, it should be measured in terms of each individual intensity level. And to be clear, ideally, any good aerobic endurance training program, no matter whether it's a 5K, marathon, or anything in between, is going to have some type of training, some dosage at each intensity level that was just mentioned before, zone 1, zone 2, zone 3. It's just that how much you spend in each individual one is going to be different depending on what you're trying to do. Your training frequency really just refers to how you split that volume of training up across a given week, just in terms of scheduling, really. So with regard to low to moderate intensity training, so zone 1, zone 2, using that graph we just talked about before. Let's say, for example's sake, you're going to do 100 minutes of that across a given week. It probably doesn't matter too much if you do that in 2 50-minute sessions or in 4 25-minute sessions. If that total weekly volume is the same, you're most likely going to see the same results, and you should just schedule and program it based on what your personal schedule allows best from a practicality standpoint. I don't think you should bracket all of it into only one session in the week, but that's more of just my opinion than anything else. If we're talking about true high intensity training, where you're getting into that zone 3, that higher end, that truly hard training, and you're staying there for a good period of time, I personally very, very rarely program that more than just one time per week. I don't think there's very rare circumstances where you're going to need that. The most common or the easiest one I can think of is if you are in the peak week of your training for a 5K, where really you want to leverage into that above all else. But apart from that, I almost never program that for clients more than just one time per week. And reason being is that if you really are doing a truly high intense training, then doing that more than one time per week is a really hard thing to recover from while still being able to do other things in the week. But again, while volume and intensity are going to be mostly determined by what your goals are, your training frequency should be mostly determined by what is most practical for you and your life and your schedule and things like that. So to wrap this video up, I wanted to give you a few different type of training structures at each individual intensity so that this all becomes hopefully a little more clear. So with low intensity training, so this is easy training. You can hold a conversation during this. You're not finishing these sessions and feeling like you just got hit by a truck. Obviously, you could do just steady state training. So this could be cycling at about 50% of your maximum heart rate for 60 minutes. It could be running at 60-ish to 70-ish% of your maximum heart rate for 30 minutes, where you're not changing the pace or the intensity throughout, and you're just going straight for a fixed number of time. Mixed modality training would be where you're using different types of endurance training within the same session. I like these sessions a lot because they make a lot of sense if you're using endurance training for the purpose of supplementing your strength training. If you are wanting to use cross training for something like running, and there's multiple different kinds of other forms of endurance training that are going to be of benefit to you, you can just bracket them all into this one session. It also makes the session a bit more variable, which can have its own benefits as well. So an easy example of this could be, let's say you're on a stationary bike for 15 minutes, you get on a rower for 15 minutes, incline walking or running, depending on how fit you are, if you're keeping it easy, for 15 minutes, and then stairs for 15 minutes. That'd be one example. But again, that can be customized in infinite numbers of ways, depending on what is most appropriate for you and what equipment you have available. Low intensity intervals would be characterized by constantly staying at an easy intensity, but changing that intensity or pace throughout the session. So let's say we're talking about running. You could run at an easy pace for, let's say, 8 minutes, walk for 2 minutes, and then you repeat that for whatever number of rounds is most appropriate for you. These are sessions that I like to use in people who are maybe trying to force a volume progression, but feel it's quite hard to do without those sort of breaks, like the walk breaks throughout that example session, or in people who are brand new and you just can't run at a low intensity for more than 5 minutes straight yet. Because again, someone who is brand new to running, even if you're experienced in other forms of training, you're going to be in high zone 2, zone 3 pretty quickly within the run from the get-go, no matter what. It's going to be real hard to keep that actually easy, or to where you can hold a conversation until you're a bit more trained. So until you're at that point, using something like a run walk interval can make a lot of sense. For moderate intensity training structures, I tend to use the same overall frameworks as we just discussed for low intensity training, just at a higher intensity than what would be used for the purpose of low intensity training. You can also toss some intervals in here as well. So let's say you're alternating between a 10-minute bout of cycling at about 50% of your maximum heart rate and 10-minute bout of running at about 70 to 80-ish% of your maximum heart rate. That would be an example of going between easy training and moderate training for a set number of intervals. Depending on the circumstance, that can make sense. But in a lot of ways, moderate intensity training, in my opinion, should look similar to low intensity training, just at that heart rate, that intensity, that pace, whatever the case may be. That is going to be more in concordance with moderate effort. High intensity training, truly high intensity training, tends to look a bit different, at least the way that I tend to program it for clients. There's two types that I tend to use most often. So you could do a couple sets of 4 to 5 minutes at a maximum effort with like 3-ish minutes of rest in between. So, if you're going to do a set of heavy squats, and let's say you're doing 4 sets, ideally you're resting somewhere between 2 to 4 minutes in between sets so that each set is of high enough quality to, actually give you an adaptation. That's what I mean when I say treat these kind of like strength training. So you're doing a set of a 4 to 5 minute all out run. You're going to then rest for sit down for 2 to 4 minutes and then do that again, the same way you would do sets of strength training. Now, granted, this is probably going to feel a bit more tiring than sets of squats. Like you're going to finish it like this and just be cooked. You're probably not going to do more than 2, maybe 3 of these. But again, hopefully that sort of paints the idea a bit. The other structure I like to use is just interval training, high intensity interval training. And I say real high intensity interval training because this isn't just going through a circuit of exercises, like squats, push-ups, whatever you see on Instagram, social media. Real high intensity interval training is where you're doing the same mode of exercise and you're just going back and forth between truly easy and truly difficult. For the purpose of inducing maximal aerobic intensity training, a structure I like a lot is, say you get on a treadmill and you go for 2 minutes at RPE 5. So RPE stands for rate of perceived exertion. It's an overly fancy way of saying how hard I want you to try on a scale from 1 to 10. So I say RPE 5. I mean, I want you to push at a 5 out of 10 effort, whatever that means for you. That means something different for everyone. So basically you go easy for about 2 minutes. You go very hard for about 4 minutes, near max effort for 4 minutes. Then you repeat that 3 to 4 times. These kind of sessions tend to hurt. And again, the purpose of this easy portion right here, these easy 2 minutes, is to induce enough recovery so that you can actually push into that near max effort for those 4 minutes to come up next. And the reason you would do this, so let's say, you're doing this for 3 rounds and you're getting therefore 12 minutes of total training time at this true high intensity. These 2-minute rest-ish breaks, let's call them, because you're still running per se, are going to allow you to spend those 12 minutes at a high intensity at a higher intensity than if you just did those 12 minutes straight. But again, when these are done right, you should be almost begging to stop, even if you really like training, because these should hurt if you're actually pushing into, that high zone 3 type of training. So with that said, that's all I got for you today. So I hope that was somewhat helpful, interesting, or somewhere between. Obviously, I can't cover everything in a video like this, but I think I covered the most of it, the most important parts. If you have any questions about anything I talked about, do not hesitate to comment them down below, and I will get back to you as soon as I can. Hope you have a good day, and I'll talk to you soon.